Hi everyone, I'm Anushka and this is Claire. We're both Year 6 students studying visual arts at SOTA, and this is part of a series of video tutorials to teach you some art techniques that you can explore on your own at home. Today's video will be about mark making and illustrations, where we will share some exciting demos as well as our own art with you. So, let's get right into it. But first, what is mark making? In art, mark making is a term used to describe the different lines, patterns, and textures that an artist creates. This can be done with any material on any surface. It is a basic way an artist can experiment with the elements of art, either to explore how different materials can create certain effects or to express themselves in an abstract and gestural way. Abstract art refers to art that does not depict subjects in a very realistic manner. Gestural art is also a type of abstract art and is usually made using energetic and expressive brushstrokes to emphasize movement. Although mark-making experiments may not necessarily result in something very refined, it is an important process that can help you become more confident in the way you create lines and textures and expand your skills in different mediums. An interesting way to view mark making is through the traditional Japanese aesthetic, wabi-sabi. Wabi-sabi focuses on accepting the beauty in imperfection. Mark making also explores this because it showcases imperfection. Think of mark-making exercises as a process instead of an outcome, so don't be afraid to try out as many things as possible. To give you a better idea on what mark-making could look like, you could also take a look at these artworks by Jackson Pollock. He creates a lot of texture and movement through his energetic brushstrokes and paint splattering. Here are also some of our own experiments in our sketchbooks from our Year 3 Drawing and Concept Development module. We used India ink and different tools like straws to create fun effects. We also used charcoal for varied texture and used mark making to explore our school's architecture. As a simple mark making exercise, we encourage you to experiment making any sort of lines, dots, patterns, and shapes with all sorts of materials you can find in your house. In abstract mark making, you can almost use any tool or object to make marks. The crazier the tool, the crazier the mark. Sometimes the most unconventional objects can create much more interesting effects than your standard brush or pen. Today, we will be showing you how to create some of the many interesting marks you could possibly try out.
One technique you could try out is using a straw to create bubbles. First, create a mixture of dish soap, water, and some kind of color like ink or watercolor. After mixing well, use a straw to blow into the mixture to create bubbles. There are two ways you can apply these onto the paper. The first is to use a smaller container and keep blowing the bubbles until it spills over onto the paper. This creates a more chunky effect. Another way is to use a flat surface that has been wet, like a ruler, to scoop out the bubbles and apply it onto the paper. This method defines the bubbles clearer. While we are using the straw to create the bubbles, we can also use it directly with the ink. Just drop the ink or diluted paint directly onto a point on the paper and blow it in the direction that you want it to go. This creates a mark that looks similar to tree branches. Chopsticks and plant stems are other materials that can be used to create marks on the paper. They can simply be dipped in ink or paint and applied, but you can try out how different plant stems can create different marks. In this demonstration, I found a dried plant stem that had a hard bristle-like texture at the end, which I used to create both gestural and controlled lines. For another flexible stem I found, I folded it and used the flat side to create regular marks. As for the chopsticks, I tried to use it in a controlled manner to create dots and lines.
Pro Touch is a technique by which you can get different textures by rubbing dry medium, like a pencil, pastel, or charcoal, over paper laid on a textured surface. I first placed a textured book cover underneath my paper and used a blue oil pastel to create marks. The second time, I used a sushi mat and a separate pastel. Try experimenting with how hard you press the pastel onto the surface of the paper. Use objects with weird textures and even try using different mediums to rub over the object. In this technique, paint is applied to another wet layer of paint or water. For this demo, I first applied water onto my paper using a brush. Here I'm using a Chinese painting brush as I like how it moves more smoothly on paper compared to a normal nylon brush. I then added in drops of green India ink into the wet splotches. For a more interesting effect, I also added in red watercolor droplets onto the ink and water. Remember, these are just a few out of the endless mark making techniques you could use, so feel free to come up with your own. Now that we have experimented with the different effects we can create using different mediums, let's move on to see how this can be applied in illustration. An illustration is a type of art form where an image is created to communicate a message or an idea. Illustrations are mainly used in posters, magazines, books, teaching materials, animations, and video games. Personally, we find illustration really fun because we don't really have to worry about how realistic the drawing looks and can play around with color, shape, and form. One of our favorite illustration influences is Art Nouveau, an art movement that used long curving lines to create interesting designs. Another aspect we like about illustration is how it explores so many different styles. For instance, when you look at these two illustrations on the left, they are both so different but are still very visually interesting. Because illustration is so diverse, we can also apply mark-making techniques here. Here are some of our own illustrations where you can see different types of marks made using color, shape, form, and lines to create various types of texture. Texture is super useful in an illustration because it adds depth to the piece. For example, when looking at Vincent van Gogh's ink drawings, we can see how he creates movement and texture simply using lines drawn in different directions and styles. Now that you've seen that mark making can be applied in illustration, we will use our knowledge of mark making to show you how you can apply these techniques to illustrations. For these demos, we will be including a mix of non-digital and digital mark making on illustrations. The digital media demo is done on Procreate on the iPad Pro. It's okay if you don't own any of this or are not comfortable using digital media, because you never know if knowledge in illustrating using this would still be useful to you in the future. For this illustration, I experimented with line in order to create different types of textures through mark making. I pressed harder at times, which created darker, thicker lines, and then pressed lighter in other parts, which produced paler, thinner lines. I also drew the lines in different directions to create a sense of movement. I started off drawing a few plants using a black drawing pen. I shaded in some parts using short lines in different directions to create more depth. Then, I added in a hooded girl representing Little Red Riding Hood through the wet on wet mark making technique using watercolor. After that, I added in more details and played around with overlapping, color, and transparency. The fun thing about illustration is that you don't have to stick to realistic looking art, and you can go really wild with your imagination.
For this illustration, I was inspired by the effect bubbling could create, as it reminded me of what cells look like under a microscope. So, I used the turquoise watercolor, soap, and water mixture to create the bubbles to make up the background. I liked how each bubble looked unique but natural, and used each bubble as a cell. I used the wooden chopstick to define some key features of the cell with watercolor. Next, I used the regular pen to partially outline some cells to make them stand out more. I made sure that the background was dry before using the pen so that the lines would not smudge and it would remain clear.
Now that we've ended our tutorial demos, we'll summarize what was taught in this video. Firstly, we went over the basics of mark making and how these techniques can be used to create various types of effects, which can then increase the depth of your artwork. At the same time, you should also have fun doing this, since the process and discoveries you make while creating marks is often more important than the end result. Next, we also introduced illustration to you and how mark making techniques can be applied to illustrations using line, color, shape, form, and texture. So, now it's your turn to try. Go find some of the weirdest tools lying at your house to start exploring these techniques. Check out the description box below for links to some YouTube videos to learn more about all of this. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed this tutorial. Stay tuned for our next few videos. Bye!